Joining me now is someone who's worked alongside President Joe Biden for decades, former White House Chief of Staff, my friend, my old boss, Ron Klain. Ron, it's just like sitting in your old office.
Doing a great job with the new show. It's great to be here.
Thank you. It's great to have you here. So the president has been pretty quiet on Trump's legal troubles for good reason. There's precedent. The indictment was about hush money payments to an adult film star. But there could be more indictments coming that are about the issues that the president is running his campaign on: defense of democracy, opposition to election denialism. Is there going to come a time where he's going to need to be more vocal about the specifics of these cases?
Look, Jen, I think the president's going to let the legal process work its way out with Donald Trump. I think he has plenty of points of contrast with Donald Trump that don't involve the courts. They involve approach to the economy. They involve what we're going to do to move our country forward. They involve issues like climate change, voting rights, abortion rights. And I think that's what you're going to see the president focused on, not so much Donald Trump's legal troubles, but the choice of which direction our country goes now.
He did, in his video, there was a reference to, of course, defense of democracy, defense of rights, and he has given some powerful speeches on those issues. With all of this, though, hanging out there, dominating the media coverage, doesn't it make it hard for him not to make that a bigger part of his campaign?
Well, I think the defense of democracy, which is a big part of his first campaign, big part of the time he's been president, will be a big part of his campaign in 2024. But I think, commenting on the various legal developments with regard to Donald Trump may not be a big part of his campaign in 2024. The president's fighting against MAGA Republicans all over this country. Unfortunately, there are too many Donald Trumpites all over the country trying to take Trump's ideas and make them the laws in various states. And that's what the president's standing up against. As he says, we need a country with more freedoms, not less freedoms.
You were the chief of staff to the president, but you've also been the chief of staff to vice presidents. So as you're watching this news break this week about former Vice President Mike Pence testifying in front of a grand jury about his former boss, President Trump, give us a little sense of how significant that is, how unprecedented that is.
Well, it is totally unprecedented, as you said, and it's obviously an incredible thing to see. Fortunately, I never worked for a vice president who worked with a criminal president, so he never had to face that. And I'm glad to see Vice President Pence doing his duty and coming forward with what he knows.
Now, you know Attorney General Garland pretty well. He's famously allergic to politics. Part of the reason, I think it's fair to say, why he was nominated by the president for this job. Yeah. But he's going to have to navigate what is sure to be a political firestorm, indictments or not. How do you think he will navigate that?
I think Judge Garland, Attorney General Garland, has always navigated it by calling it straight, by trying to approach the facts and the law as he finds them. I'm sure that's what he'll do, even in an election year, even in controversial times. He's going to be who he is.
No, he's also been criticized. I've been a defender of his. I know you have been as well. What do people not understand about his process and how he approaches legal cases?
Well, I think that, Judge Garland believes very much in the integrity of the Justice Department and in institutional norms there. And I think at a time when a lot of Americans, including me, would like to see the Justice Department get more aggressive in court defending voting rights, defending reproductive rights, that more cautious, measured approach seems just not aggressive enough, given the threats that our rights face.
So do you think the Justice Department should be more aggressive on those voting rights than they are being now?
I think they should look for opportunities to go to court and make it clear that voter intimidation is wrong, and that some of these efforts in these states to limit women's rights to travel, get information, get the medical care they need is contrary to our laws and contrary to the broader principles of our Constitution, yes.
But do you think the pace at which Attorney General Garland has operated on the cases against Trump and naming Jack Smith is the appropriate pace?
I think that I'm not going to comment on that. I'm going to let the Justice Department make its decisions on individual cases.
So most of us are operating under the assumption Trump is going to be the nominee. I've said that. I know you've said that recently. And the choice there seems pretty clear. Competence versus chaos, defense of democracy against not defending democracy. Yeah. If it's someone else, like a Ron DeSantis, does the case change?
I don't think it does. Obviously, it was different. Donald Trump is unique in many ways. But I think you're seeing in Governor DeSantis someone who shares a lot of Trump's views on key things like reproductive freedom, voting rights, other issues like that. I think this choice the president framed in his announcement video between more freedoms and less freedoms That's a choice against any Trump-like Republican nominees in 2024. And I think also the president will be running on his record. That doesn't change with regard to who his opponent is. So I think the race is going to be the race. I think it's going to look kind of the same no matter who the Republicans nominate. If they nominate someone from the MAGA wing of their party, which seems almost certain.
I personally think this argument over the president's age is overwrought, in part because part of the argument is his experience. And also, by the way, Donald Trump is 76 years old and he's currently the front runner. But it's clearly a favorite argument of Republican candidates. I mean, Nikki Haley suggested the president won't live for through the next 5 years. So are there moments, I know the president's response is just watch me, but are there moments where it's beyond the pale, where there needs to be a different response?
Look, I think the response is the president doing his job, and I think we all see that every day, the rigors with which the president works, things like his trip to Ukraine, which was an incredibly arduous and dangerous trip that the president took. I think they answer the mail on the questions about his age. I understand why voters ask it. Voters asked it in 2020 and decided that he was the right person for the job. I think the same thing will happen in 2024. Not only is the president up to the job and doing the job, but frankly, the choice between Joe Biden, either Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis, is a stark choice. And I think issues of who stands for what and the record and what he'll do going forward, those are going to overcome any questions about age.
Now, the president's progress on judicial nomination, something you were very involved in as the chief of staff, is a big part of his legacy and yours as the chief of staff. It's essentially frozen right now because Senator Feinstein has been out with shingles, and the Republicans have refused to agree to a swap. You've expressed confidence that the Republicans on the committee will eventually agree on his nominees. When I heard that, I was thinking, I wish I was in Ron's office so I could ask him what he meant by that. So are you referring to, you think they will have to support qualified nominees, or do you think there'll be a process change that allows for these nominees to move forward?
Well, I think one of the two will have to happen. The president's agenda on getting these judges confirmed is an important part of his overall agenda. He's had strong support from Leader Schumer, from Chairman Durbin, and most of those nominees have been confirmed on a bipartisan basis. What you have right now is nominees bottled up in the committee who actually would get a majority of votes, including some Republican votes, if they could get to the Senate floor. And when we had a 50-50 Senate, we were able to get them out of committee with a discharge motion. With the Democratic majority, there are no discharge motions. So there either needs to be a process to get them out of the committee, even with Senator Feinstein's absence, or to deal with her absence. But the process of filling vacancies on the federal bench must continue. And I'm confident that Senator Schumer and Senator Durbin will find a way to move forward on it.
Now, one of the things in your very lengthy resume is that you were the counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee under when President Biden was the chairman of that committee. So it sounds like there is something that could happen in the Senate that could allow these things to move forward, potentially.
I think they will find a way to do it. Senate rules can always be changed. And, I think that Senator Schumer, Senator Durbin have accommodated Republicans on the issue like the blue slip policy and have taken Republican input on judges from their states. And I think in exchange for that, it's only reasonable that the nominees that are qualified be allowed to move out of committee and face a vote on the Senate floor.
There has also been a drip. You're an institutionalist, I think it's fair to say, a defender of institutions, as is the president, including the Supreme Court. And there has been a drip in the last few weeks about lavish spending, about not disclosing gifts, about relatives benefiting from justices' membership on the court. It feels broken to people who don't know what's going on there. Do you think it can be fixed, and how could it be fixed?
Well, I think the same ethics rules that apply in full force to the other federal judges should apply to the Supreme Court. I think people think it's odd that not all the same ethical rules apply to the court. And I think what we've seen from the court recently on this isn't up to the high standards the court should be held. And I hope that the justices will come forward and adopt the same kind of ethical rules that other federal judges have applied to them. I know Senator Whitehouse has been working on this very hard. Other senators have too. It's time to bring the court up to the same ethical standards as other judges.
Another issue you worked on when you were the counsel to the committee was the assault weapons ban, which was passed when the president was the chairman. There is not an assault weapons ban in place today. There was another shooting this weekend in Texas using an AR-15, and 5 people, including an 8-year-old, were killed in that shooting. you're a very savvy political guy, too. I mean, why do you think the politics of moving forward on an assault weapons ban don't exist right now? Or am I wrong in that assessment?
I think the politics exist. The votes in Capitol Hill don't exist. And that's up to the voters to change in 2024. And it's important that they do. You're right. In the 1990s, we passed a ban on a number of specific assault weapons, including the AR-15, and mass shootings went down. One of the most difficult parts of my job as White House Chief of Staff was getting that call in the middle of the night, way too many nights, about another mass shooting with an AR-15. It's crazy that we allow our children and our friends and neighbors to be gunned down this way. We were able to ban this gun before for a decade, from 1994 until 2004 when it expired. The number of mass shootings went down. We shouldn't tolerate what's going on in our country anymore. It's unacceptable. And I think the voters feel that way, and hopefully they will give us a Congress in 2024 that will join with President Biden in reinstating that assault weapon ban that he helped put in place in the 1990s.
Needs to be a different Congress. So before I let you go, Mother's Day is coming up. Yes. I know from knowing you for a long time that your mother was an incredibly important person in your life. I just wanted to ask you to tell me, you're going to make me cry, but tell me a little bit about her. I mean, how did she raise a person who became the White House Chief of Staff, became the Vice President's Chief of Staff, is a mentor to many? So tell me a little bit about your mother.
My mother was an amazing woman. We lost her at the end of February. It was very, very sad. Obviously, still is for me. She dropped out of school at age 18, never finished college, had me when she was 19, put her heart and soul into raising her 3 children, and also running 2 small businesses and eventually playing a major role in civic life in Indianapolis, where I grew up. And she's going to be very much missed this Mother's Day.
I know she is, and I know she would be so incredibly proud of you and your family and her grandkids as well.
Absolutely.
Ron Klain, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Jen.